We live in difficult times. Conflict pervades our culture. Polarization undermines our social relationships and threatens our democratic life. On our campuses, students, faculty, and administrators seem increasingly prone to distrust, and many are wary of engaging at all about topics that might become controversial. What values and practices might balance against this tide of polarization and distrust? What resources from Catholic and Jesuit traditions might be of help? And how can Jesuit institutions better prepare people for the hard work of deep civic engagement in these times? I'm Jim McCartan, a member of the theology faculty at Fordham University and the chair of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, which publishes conversations on Jesuit higher education. I've invited three leaders to explore how Jesuit education can help within this context. Our conversation moderator is Kim Daniels, the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. She's joined by Julie Schumacher-Cohen, Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs at the University of Scranton, and by David McCallum, a member of the Society of Jesus based in Rome, who serves as Executive Director of the Program for Discerning Leadership, an initiative designed to build leaders' capacity to engage in the work of discernment. Kim Daniels begins the conversation.
Well, it's so wonderful to be here with both of you today, David and Julie. I'm just so excited and looking forward to our conversation. David, I wonder if we might start with you. Could you tell us a little bit more about your background and what you bring to this conversation about discernment and dialogue?
Sure. I've been a Jesuit for 33 years now. Kind of startles me a little bit to say that, but it's true. I spent the better part of my active ministry after ordination in higher education. I was involved as a faculty member at Lemoyne College and as a dean of their business school and as vice president for mission integration there for about 12 years. And my background in terms of my doctoral work is in the area of adult learning and leadership. So the intersection of how we mature as adults and how we exercise authority. And all of that with the background in Ignatian spirituality. So it's kind of an intersection of different areas. And for the last 4 years, I've been directing a program here in Rome, basically out of our Jesuit Curia, that is aimed at senior Vatican officials and the superior generals of religious orders headquartered in Rome. And it's a formation program in discerning leadership for synodality. So over the last 2 years, since Pope Francis's invitation for the church to enter into this synodal process, we've had a real motive to move forward and a big demand.
And there must be so many fraught conversations in that process and in the other engagements that you're involved in your work, right? Just bringing a group of people together from around the globe, from different backgrounds and perspectives and locations. What makes people so apprehensive to engage in these kinds of difficult or challenging conversations today?
Whether you whether you're thinking about the political context or the religious context, I think the great fear is to enter into these polarities, these polarized conversations where people are so easily triggered and they don't have ways of navigating this conflict of ideologies. We're all kind of hooked by our ideological backgrounds and our passions, and without a kind of common ground, a kind of relational context where we can trust that we're going to come out of this alive, we try not to enter into the meaningful conversations. We almost are, I think, so super sensitive about offending or being offended that we just, put our kid gloves on. And so it's a moment really that's calling for a growth and skills and development and practices that really help us to navigate. And in the synod context too, there's a lot of fear about what could be lost, and a lot less clarity about what could be gained by entering into the synodal process. So I think a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty is at play.
That's fascinating. Julie, I'd love to turn to you now. You come at this from a different I mean, from a very similar context, right? But on campus and with community engagement. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you bring to this conversation?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me here. So I am the Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs at the University of Scranton. And I've been in the city of Scranton for about 14 years and almost about that time at the university. So work a lot with local community, so local community groups and neighborhood, and also with our faculty and students around community-based learning, service learning. And then we have had a political dialogues initiative since 2017. So I'll talk about that and the experience that we've had doing campus dialogues and also with community members on all sorts of different topics. I bring to this, I worked prior to coming to Scranton, I worked for an organization called Churches for Middle East Peace, and I still serve on their Catholic Advisory Council. So longtime work in Israel-Palestine, peace building, dialogue, and advocacy. And of course, that's something that's very close to my heart right now. And then I'm working on my PhD at Temple in political science. So I've taught in our as an adjunct in our political science department and see a lot of these issues through the lens of how we're looking at polarization, in political science.
So interesting. So you bring so much to the conversation, and I'd love to hear more about several of those experiences. And in particular, from that background, why do you think people are so apprehensive, so nervous about engaging in these kind of really tough conversations?
Yeah, well, I think David, hit on a lot of the important points. I think there's a lot of anxiety coming from different directions. I know we hear from students that they're afraid to say the wrong things, to be misunderstood. This is a generation that's come up on social media, and you can say something wrong and it can last on the internet forever in that context. Certainly just uncomfortable about disagreement and conflict and how to manage that. People worrying about being in a place where they have to affirm something that they really oppose. And I think we can talk more about that in terms of how you set the dialogue up. And also, I know talking with faculty when you're trying to generate conversation in a class is how to invite that, but not put somebody on the spot or make them feel singled out because of their identity or their viewpoint. So, those are just some of the things that I was thinking about coming today. And also, I was, there's been so many think pieces in the last few years about the Thanksgiving dinner table and how stressful that's become, and because of our political context, but for other contexts as well. And I think it speaks to how that's one of the few times in the year where you might be in a room or in a space with people that you're kind of forced to be there, but you really may be coming with different perspectives. You may not have all the same, worldview anymore than your family than you might have in the past, and yet you have to spend this time together. And I think a lot of times at different points in the year, other than that Thanksgiving dinner table, you might avoid those kinds of conversations where you're going to be in a space with people that you might not totally agree with. So that's just something I was thinking about too, is that people are anxious about that.
Sure, people are anxious. I feel like we all see that in our engaged professional lives, our personal lives. I wonder, we hear a lot also about the loss of connection these days, right? The loss of community, the epidemic of loneliness. I wonder, Julie, if you see any of that as leading into this kind of apprehension and fear, right, that people have around engagement. Do you think, in other words, are they fearful about losing the ties they do have? Is there any way in which that factors in?
Yeah, we did it we had the first in-person dialogue pass after COVID. I think it was in the spring of 2022. And so on the positive side, it was intergenerational in the sense that we sometimes do them with just students, but this was students and community members. So different ages, which really makes a big difference, I think. And we had a lot of relief expressed to us, like people just expressed gratitude to be able to be in a space, in a room where they could have the hard conversation. They felt that it was positive, that there was something worthwhile going on there. So I think that being siloed in our online spaces, the COVID environment, which has also really impacted the students that are in, at our universities right now. They've gone through different phases of it. Some of them were first year in high school or whatever. It affected their ability to actually, I think, be in a physical space in person, talking with people that they may not be on the same page with. So I think you have to practice it. And I think that's, a little bit about what we try to do with the campus dialogues.
David, how about you? Do you feel like that loss of community, that sense of that loss, certainly during COVID, of opportunities to be physically present with others, does that affect how these conversations go or our experience of them right now?
Tim, I think that it's hampered, right? A lot of our sense of being equipped to get into these conversations. And I think there's a longing that people have to belong again, and to have those meaningful connections in a way that are part of our just human nature, our mammal nature, right? To be social. And in the Synod, for instance, it was just so striking that the emergence of friendships amongst these very diverse participants in the synod process were foundational for the hard conversations that actually happened over the course of that month. The friendships that were formed in the retreat, the friendships that formed around the table with the sustained inquiry into these hard questions. But as people were having coffee together and going out for pizza together and enjoying a glass of wine, there was a sense that we were creating a kind of container for deeper conversations. But without that container, without a sense that there's going to be a relationship elastic enough to give and take, I think, yeah, there's a sensitivity, there's a sense of fragility we have about the hard conversations.
You know, one thing I was struck, I had the wonderful opportunity to be there at the Synod as well in October. And one thing I was struck by what you just identified, David, the importance of friendship. I was also struck by the importance of prayer, the retreat ahead of time, the sacraments. And I wonder if you might see the way in which those resources and that wonderful just the centrality of our tradition brought people together, both sort of our Catholic tradition generally, prayer of the sacraments, for the retreat, and also just any Ignatian elements of that you might bring forward.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to say here. I mean, I would say one thing, just picking up from your example, the experience of being in these really amazing and beautiful liturgies, some of them very different from our norm. For instance, celebrated in a more Orthodox Byzantine style, or the experience of this Mass under the chair of St. Peter with this beautiful, beautiful, but really Gregorian style music, which for many is not their norm, but it had a kind of feeling of transcendence that was transporting, and I think carried us each beyond our native cultures and preferences, so that we were having a common experience together of liturgy, of beauty, of God's presence, and then of table fellowship that was truly inclusive. To look around at the faces, right, and the different ecclesiastical levels that were represented, and people from every corner of the globe all together, coming to the table. Wow, it's very powerful. And I think even at a level beyond what we could actually express. So I think those experiences of prayer are, at one point, Julie, we had a shared prayer in October for peace, and it was a kind of rosary procession through St. Peter's Basilica together with candlelight. And it was so moving to hear the Our Father prayed in Aramaic by an Iraqi sister. I mean, those moments, they definitely carried us beyond, I think, the kind of constraints and the limits of our own narrow selves, put us in touch with a wider community. Thanks.
And I wonder, Julie, just to pick up on that. So David's talked about some factors that really added to the moments of dialogue and engagement at the Synod. I'd love to hear from you some key dimensions of fruitful dialogue that you see on your campus or your engagement with the community when you have conflicting parties come together.
Sure. So we have run those political dialogues since 2017. Obviously, this is a whole period of time that we recognize that there's a huge amount of polarization in the United States. And I also want to shout out a national organization that we work with called Essential Partners, because we pick up on their format of reflective, structured dialogue, which is very much in line, I think, and that's how we've run it in terms of Ignatian principles and practices. So, and I'll talk a little bit about how we bring that in. But I think first and foremost, you need to have a format, and so ours is it's structured, and depending on what you're running, it can be less structured or more structured, and then have reflection, which of course we all know is so important. I want to say one thing about polarization, because I think sometimes people get a little bit almost like fearful of it. And I think we also need to see it as an opportunity, in the sense that it's a sign of the times. It's telling us that there are gaps and differences in our society around issues that matter. And these conflicts are surfacing and they're more sort of raw or urgent. When you think historically, we can think of the civil rights movement as a polarizing time, but it was also a time that made progress. So I always like to say that polarization is really an invitation to dialogue, and dialogue can help us to, kind of push back on its worst effects, like dehumanization, like political stalemate, like obviously at its worst, political violence. So in terms of how the dialogue can be most fruitful, I think being clear about its purpose, and our work is really to build understanding, which is, maybe a simple kind of goal, but it's something I think is very important. And that's really the sort of aim of the dialogues that we run. We've done them on all different issues: immigration, guns, free speech, racial injustice, values and voting, abortion, America's role in the world. So we really, pick up on everything that's happening. So we're not necessarily trying to achieve common ground. That can come out of it, but we're trying to get where people are coming from with their political views. So we ask a lot of questions about what's an experience or a story, what's something that is, what connects you to this issue, what brings you to it, so that we're getting a little bit behind the scenes of that viewpoint or that perspective. So that's a really important piece. So I can talk more about, I think that the Ignatian piece for us, we do a lot of preparation of students where we talk about how this comes out of our tradition, including when St. Ignatius wrote to the fathers attending the Council of Trent. We say, listening to understand is not a new idea. It goes back to the 1500s when he's saying you have to understand the meaning, the leanings, and the wishes of those who speak before you speak yourself. So listening to understand, and then also being able to articulate your own viewpoints.
I love that. And I also love the idea that conflict, that these difficult conversations, engagement is really an opportunity, right? We shouldn't lean away from it. We should lean towards it. It's an opportunity to witness to our mission, to really engage with another person in a way that we might not otherwise. So I love that about what you said. David, I wonder if you might pick up on what Julie just said about sort of different Ignatian practices that can help us here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Julie got us started with that notion of seeking first to understand. And I think there's a kind of theological and existential principle underneath seeking first to understand. It's not just practical. It's this sense that the way in which we experience separateness in the world is actually something of an illusion, that the basis of our experience as human beings and as creatures is that we all share this experience of being created. We actually are expressing a diversity of a single experience of being. It's metaphysical. And what we long for is a reconnectedness with one another, which may involve forgiveness and reconciliation and dialogue and kind of working through things. But to overcome that sense that in some ways we don't belong to each other, we don't know each other, we don't have an obligation to each other. No, the seek first to understand, I think this notion that Ignatius had came from this deep experience of a radical sense of being interconnected with one another, that we are inter-individual in a sense, and that our separateness is something that has to be healed and reconciled. So yeah, and then to build on that, I'd say there's 5 or 6 principles I take from Ignatian discernment. I'll list them real quick and then we can unpack them if it makes sense later. So that first one is to seek understanding. Another is to analyze, but reflexively, to always come back to oneself and say, how am I part of this puzzle? Where is my bias, my partiality of perspective influencing and creating distortion, right, in this experience of relationship? Where have I made the mistake of exercising unilateral power rather than being mutual, right? So as Jesus would say, like, take the 2x4 out of your own eye first, right? The third would be pray and meditate. For many of us, we might think, oh, I'm totally equipped to deal with this conflict on my own, self-sufficiently. But qualitatively, I could speak from my own experience. If I take something to prayer, and those with whom I'm in conflict, sometimes it's in Jesuit community, when we pray together about something, it lifts our perspective and shifts our horizon, I think, within which we're kind of moving toward whatever future God's calling us to. It might seem quaint to people to pray over something, but I mean, I would say I've had my own heart stretched and opened by the experience of prayer. I'd say the fourth one is observe the movements of spirit. Notice when we're in consolation and feeling deeply peaceful and harmonious with ourselves and with others, with God. And notice when we're not. And notice the quality of action that flows when we're moving from consolation or desolation, right? So that movement and consolation is so key. The fifth, seek what's God's will rather than my own. Come into a conflict with a sense of humility, with a sense that there's a future that God's calling forth that is bigger than me. And so my agenda is somehow going to be included in what God wants, and to trust that. And then the last would be to trust, as Julie is making really clear, the importance of a structure and process. Not doing something without, really kind of giving it some trustworthy container and a vehicle to kind of bring us through the process. Those would be my 6 principles.
Wonderful, so helpful.
Does that resonate? Yeah.
Very much. And I wonder, Julie, I would love to hear your reaction to that. You started to tell us a little bit about Ignatian approaches in your own work. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so like I said, we bring both the idea of what comes out of Saint Ignatius and his writings on dealing with others. We also bring in the presupposition, as many are familiar with, sort of the Jesuit plus sign, and also try to unpack that for students, because sometimes they can reduce it to the idea of just giving people, the other person, sort of the benefit of the doubt. And I think it's and David, you can chime in too, to kind of correct us as I'm talking through this, but that I think it's more complicated, it's richer than that. And because we will also say, it's a process of learning about the other person. So you may hear something from someone that really actually upsets you. So you're not just giving them the benefit of the doubt, but you're sitting in that discomfort and you're asking yourself, where is that coming from? How can I better understand that? How can I interpret that? So we use that, and then we kind of unpack it a little bit. I think another important point about fruitful dialogue for us has been making sure, first of all, that people feel comfortable being there. They have to have agency in being in that conversation, because it requires vulnerability. So we talk about, with our partners at Essential Partners, they use the phrase a safe enough space. You've heard brave spaces. There's all sorts of kind of terminology that can be used, but you make the container, you create, structures. We do things like with rounds, we have time frames, we have, I can talk more about some of the mechanics of that, but ultimately you're trying to make it a productive space. But at the end of the day, there's always a certain amount of vulnerability, especially because you're asking people to bring their stories, their experiences, their personal values to why these issues matter. And so there's always going to be a little bit of risk involved in that. So you want people to be there and to be engaged and to feel comfortable doing that.
So what happens? That's wonderful, Julie. And maybe I just follow up a little bit. This all sounds so, I mean, this sounds like a wonderful approach, right? It sounds very extremely helpful. But we all know that these conversations can get really challenging. And when people are vulnerable, it's particularly likely sometimes to hit, for them to really be hit when something is said that disturbs them. I wonder, what do you do when when these conversations go in a negative direction?
So the dialogues that we have are set up with facilitators. So we do that. These are very structured. So not everyone has the opportunity to do those kinds of dialogues. But if you do, you have facilitators, and they're trained to be able to step in. And one of the ways that stepping in happens is that we use what we call communication agreements. And so things like, we'll speak for ourselves from our own experiences using I statements, and avoid speaking in generalizations. So if someone is saying, well, all those people think this, they kind of put something like that into the room. That's a way to be able to say, let's come back to, let's hear a little bit more where you're coming from on that, on that issue or on that topic. So that helps you kind of, gives you kind of a grounding. What we use, and this is really, I think, used in many different contexts, is timed rounds. So that, we'll usually have 2 rounds of questions around a particular topic, and everyone has about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes to respond. And we have found that addresses so many problems. First of all, everyone has a chance to speak. Everyone has a chance to listen. and there's no crosstalk in those rounds. And so it creates equal status in the space. When you're talking about the biggest problem in dialogue is power differentials and hierarchies, and that people are going to feel like that the most important issues, the most difficult issues aren't going to be brought into the room. That's what we found. People don't want to do that. If they don't want to be in dialogue if they feel like there's not going to be a serious conversation. And the timed rounds is one of, I think, really the easiest tools we have to make that a productive experience for people.
So David, that's wonderful, Julie. And David, my just sort of initial reaction to that is it sounds very much like what happened at the Synod with the conversations in the Spirit. Can you describe for people who might not be familiar with that, what those conversations around those round tables were like, and what were some of the results of them?
That's great. Julie did such a great job. I mean, going down the ground rules, the role of facilitation, the timed rounds, all those are critical components to what happened in the Synod. And many people did not, well, first of all, conversation in the Spirit, this notion of 3 rounds of spiritual conversation was new for, I'd say, 80% of the folks. What is it? Well, it's to, first of all, pray over the important questions. So it's not only coming with what we think, but it's to bring our subjectivity into the process and to trust that our subjectivity is a channel through which the Spirit is actually communicating and working with us. First round, we're listening to one another in these very short, very carefully prepared sort of statements with silences in between. Silences which allow the words to sink in, for us to actually register our responses within ourselves. Then the second round, you move from the I experience to the we, because the second round is to actually share then from this prayerful space what was moved in me as I was listening to someone else, not just trying to pile on my own points, but to actually join with the experience of another person empathetically with an open heart, and to express even differences, but to do so in a way with respect, with care, so to hold that polarity in a way that doesn't disrespect or disallow the view of the other person. Once that second round has taken place, there's a sense in which now we're not just a collection of individuals, we're a group with its own life, with its own kind of way in which the Spirit is moving through us collectively. So the third round is then to give voice to what is being expressed through the group as a whole. What are the movements of convergence, of divergence? What are the questions that really are still really alive for us? And once people got that sort of the discipline and the structure and the practice of this, and got some facility over it over the course of a few days, the experience of trusting it, of actually looking forward to it, because there was a kind of generativity that space allows. You don't hear the same conversation that you predict. What you experience is something new being brought forth by the group. And so many times people talked about expecting one thing and experiencing something completely beautiful, unexpected, full of consolation, more creative, more complex than any one person could have put on the table themselves. And I think that, again, it could be very messy. Not every conversation was facilitated to the same degree and with skill. But I think by and large, wow, this is a process that can generate tremendous fruit. And it's not the only way of just doing discernment together, but it's a really helpful, concise practice. And it could be done by any group.
It's fascinating. My background is as a lawyer, and so I'm trained in this very oppositional approach, right, to resolving issues. And one of the wonderful things that I've learned in the work that we do at the initiative and being in a Jesuit institution at Georgetown is what real dialogue looks like and how to make it fruitful, and how to really come to some common ground moving forward without that being the ultimate goal. And one thing we've learned at the initiative, Julie, we do something very similar to what you're describing, right? We bring people together around sometimes challenging issues. And one thing we're really focused on is not making it that kind of two-person debate or a debate between two sides of an issue, but rather to have a variety of different perspectives at the table. I know that that's something that's been so helpful and such an opportunity for growth for me personally has been to see how important it is to have diverse perspectives in the conversation. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Yeah, that's kind of, in our view, part of sort of the container, meaning you won't have a very fruitful dialogue if you only have, one sort of side, or even two sides, two sides per se, because I think there's often more than one or two perspectives. So we very practically, we pre-poll people, whether it's on an issue topic or whether it's something that makes sense in terms of asking them where they sort of align politically. So that we can, when each group is broken out, we know we have a diversity of backgrounds as well as viewpoints in the room. And that is its own sort of self-regulating part of the conversation then. So something is said and somebody else feels a little differently and they come back and forth and have that conversation. I think that when people are concerned that maybe dialogue isn't for them or it's not appealing, it's because they're worrying about, am I going to be the only one in the room with that viewpoint? How is my viewpoint going to be received? If somebody feels marginalized in a society or a conversation, they're going to again ask, how are the power differentials going to be worked out? We just did something on campus where we used everybody used their first name. So even though there were students, faculty, and administrators, for the purpose of the dialogue, you were Julie and David, because that on campus, we see those hierarchies playing out. And that's not always possible, but if you can do that, you want to bring people again to that kind of equal status. And then also making sure that the hard issues that are important for people to have in the conversation are there. Because otherwise someone's going to say, if this is just going to be sort of normalizing an issue or not getting to the heart of the matter, then that's not appealing to me. I don't really want to be in that dialogue. So you want to be sure that you're naming, it's kind of bringing, again, it's being comfortable with conflict and being willing to name the conflict and put it in the room so that the dialogue is a chance for people to work at it, not to get away from conflict or sort of ignore it.
Can I just follow up there? You mentioned your experience working on issues in the Middle East, and obviously right now it's hard to think of anything that is just more an area of conflict, and certainly conflicts that have come to our campuses around this. What lessons have you learned about engaging with that situation that maybe have taught you how to engage with these situations more broadly?
Yeah, it's a very difficult time. I think one thing that I always, because my own career has been a journey of dialogue and advocacy and education. And I think putting dialogue on a continuum of sort of, from a political science perspective, of sort of deliberative democracy all the way to participatory democracy. So dialogue is one piece of your participation. You want to learn, you want to dialogue, you encounter, and then you're also going to vote. Maybe you're going to protest, maybe you're going to be part of a vigil. There's all different ways for you to engage, because sometimes people feel that the issue is so raw that they can't dialogue right this minute and they need to be out doing something else. And I think you have to give people space, to do that. In terms of the Middle East, what I was just talking about what is the dialogue about? Are the hard issues going to be in the room? Are there going to be people that have different perspectives? Those are a lot of the kinds of questions that are very operative in terms of thinking about dialogues on Israel-Palestine. And that dialogue isn't only about sort of harmony or niceness, or maybe not even at all about that. It's about creating that space where you can, again, have dissent. We often talk about in one of our pieces in our communication agreement is actually that civility does not mean lack of dissent, because I think students sometimes are afraid that if they disagree that they're being impolite, at least in a sort of dialogue context. And we really want to kind of, disrupt that idea. And in this case, this semester, what we're doing, and I think other campuses have been successful with this, we're going to have a modeling of dialogue so we're going to do Israel-Palestine this spring. We're going to have a Jewish scholar and a Palestinian scholar coming before, who have been working together and are, coming from different attachments and connections to the land and to the issues, but are finding ways to work together but still have different ways that they see things. So have people, encourage them to attend that and then come to the dialogue on campus. So I know, Kim, you do wonderful work in your initiative to do that kind of modeling where you have different perspectives so that people can see that it's possible. And I think that we don't always do that. You can use text, you can use films, you can use, panels that are before a dialogue, but I think that can be really helpful too.
Oh, that's incredibly helpful. Thanks, Julie. I was struck by something, and David, I wonder if you might react to this and anything else, of course. I was struck by what you said about this not being about harmony or niceness, or just civility. Sometimes I'm allergic to the word civility because I think it's really not what we're getting at. It seems to cut off conversation rather than open it up. And I think that we're all, when we talk about dialogue, we're not engaged in finding some least common denominator, right? We're not trying to get to some mushy middle. I think oftentimes people fear that that's what dialogue is about, and they reflexively dismiss it because of that. David, can you talk a little bit more about that? Are you just going for a sort of civil approach where we all get along? How are you trying to get to the principles at stake?
No, that would be really boring and unproductive. And in fact, I hate to say it, but I really appreciate the importance of conflict as a way of refining ideas and helping us to get to a deeper level of the conversation. So I would say the beauty of Ignatian discernment is it brings in the head, the heart, and the gut, right? So it involves all these three subjectivities we've got, and it's all about refining them so that we have better ideas, we have deeper compassion and more heart and openness, and a willing to take action for the good, right? And that's a formation process. I think one of the challenges is we enter into these experiences and we presume kind of formation that many of us don't have for active listening, for really critical reasoning, for the experience of challenging our own assumptions. All that stuff is stuff that we have to learn and practice and get better at. And all of it's necessary for doing discernment in common or democratic dialogue, right? So when Habermas talks about the importance of the skills we need for engagement in democracy, that criticality is a critical component. Timothy Radcliffe, in Kidding with the Jesuits, would say, this is one thing that we really don't want to lose, this Thomistic value for criticality and debate. And so somehow that has to find its place in this discernment process. If we're losing that sense of being open to new facts, perspectives, deeper, more clear thinking, then we've lost a critical opportunity too.
I love that. I love all our conversation that we've had about Ignatian discernment and different principles that we bring to this conversation. The most well-known Jesuit in the world is Pope Francis. And I think about all of the Ignatian principles that he's brought to his pontificate and that he's modeled in so many ways. Accompaniment, the idea of generosity. I just think of his willingness to engage with hard and challenging questions as well. Julie, in your work on your campus and your community engagement, do you find that you look to Pope Francis at all as someone who resonates with students, whose model resonates with students or with others? Do you find that you've learned things from his approach or the reverse? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think he's just shown himself to be a world leader that, is a model, I think, for so many. I think also beyond people who are connected to the Catholic Church, on this question right now in relation to hold the Holy Land in Israel and Gaza. He's been one of the few people who really shows empathy toward Palestinians and Israelis. He's been very concerned about war and he's spoken out on it. So he's shown what it looks like to be kind of close, I think, to people. And the Patriarch in the Holy Land, Patriarch Isabella, has also talked about this idea of closeness. So you really need to get yourself in there. And we have so many different, again, practices of encounter and accompaniment that take us to the place of where there is suffering and where people are on the margins. So I will go back again, not to be on the same pattern today in terms of my emphasis, but I did pull out of his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, where he's really talking about reconciliation and how do you actually get there, and that it can't be kind of a cheap reconciliation, and that in order for it to be authentic, and I'll quote him, he says, "You cannot flee from conflict. Authentic reconciliation is achieved in conflict, resolving it through dialogue and open, honest, and patient negotiation." So again, I think he's calling us to do the work. You can't get to that end goal without having to kind of go through the fire a bit of, and as David has said, we're talking about dialogue that's very that's rich, that's deep, and that's difficult. And that's why you also need all these tools and supports, I think, to get through that process.
David, how about you? What do you think about that? About Pope Francis' role here and about going through the fire? Thank you, Julie, for bringing up Fratelli Tutti, which is such a resource here.
One of my favorite expressions that Pope Francis uses is that we can't be afraid of squilibrio, which is a fantastic Italian word for the disequilibrium, right? The sense of feeling unbalanced. And it's when we have our feeling of 2 feet firmly planted in the ground that we forget that we're not sufficient, that we need to depend on God and one another to kind of find our way. And that feels really important when it comes to conflict. That conflict is a lot about repenting from our unilateral uses of power. And so how do we repent from that and then find a way to be multilateral, right? So I love this notion of being in squilibrio. The other thing I love about Pope Francis is that he's got the inner freedom to admit when he's wrong. And so he's obviously a man of clear-sightedness, of passion, of deep purpose, and he makes mistakes, and he asks for forgiveness. And I think if we're going to make progress in this kind of time of polarization and conflict, we need that ourselves. We need this inner freedom to admit our own partiality, that we make mistakes, to ask for forgiveness, to take responsibility. I think those are critical.
I love that. I love, when I teach a seminar on Pope Francis and Catholic social thought, and my students always come in and just Pope Francis is someone whose work, whose approach, whose model really resonates with them. And I think I always think of him engaging with young people. And one thing that he points out time and time again is how much we have to learn from young people. Julie, I wonder, we're all on campuses, we're engaged with young people in different ways. I wonder if you might, what do we learn? What do you learn from young people? What do you learn from the people on your campus, students, how they approach these difficult issues?
Well, it actually made me think of, we did a kind of story exchange, slight sort of dialogue with a little bit different format in a high school. And this was maybe about a year ago. And our theme was around immigration. And wow, these students talked about the journeys that their families had of immigration to Scranton. Scranton is a historic source, place of immigration during the coal mining era, but we have many Latino families coming, as well as refugees from Bhutan and from parts of Africa and the Middle East. And I left that so inspired because they had, first of all, they were real about, I think the thing about young people today is that they're not interested in things that are not real. They really want to be part of it. And I think that's part of what draws people actually to Pope Francis, because he's not somebody who feels inauthentic. He feels very real. You feel like, wow, if I could be in the room with him, I would feel touched by his wisdom. So that it just brought me back to that conversation. So I think these young people are real. They want to be involved in real things. When they get in the dialogue and they feel like they can be in that sort of safe enough space, they do open up. So they're hungry for opportunities to do that and to get offline, frankly, to get off, all the social media and to have a real conversation. And so I think it's really, it's difficult as of a time that we're in. I think it's also an exciting time because I think we have opportunities where this generation will hopefully, improve the world from where we are. They're going to lead us to a new place. So I'm excited about it. Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's been my reaction as well. David, I think at the Synod, what I was often struck by, like many people, is what a wonderful voice the young people who were there were in terms of sparking dialogue. What's your reaction to that?
No doubt about it. I mean, I think one of the things that was disorienting to a lot of the theologians and the kind of ecclesiastical hierarchy is that, when these young people spoke from their direct experience, they captivated the attention of the group of 450 people in a way that even the loftiest theologians couldn't quite recruit people's attention. And so there was this competition, in a sense, between their authenticity and the kind of expertise, authority that a lot of the others brought. But I think what it created was an invitation to say, listen, our experience as a church, if we're going to be inclusive about it, it has to make space for those authentic stories and for the witness that young people of faith bring in a time of so many challenges to our faith, that in many ways their testimony and witness is more powerful than, well, so many of our other experts, right? So yeah, I'd say that was an incredibly enriching way of expanding the audience and the participation in the synod.
I love it. Well, as we get close to the end of our time together here today, I'm struck by what we've heard, right? So I think what I've heard from you all is the importance of structuring the process. Trust the process, I think, for the basketball fans out there, right? That dialogue, real dialogue, has some different components to it. What active listening looks like, how it has a container for capturing these kinds of difficult conversations and channeling them forward to something productive. The importance of Ignatian principles, secondly, and how much a resource the Ignatian principles are, and discernment, and what it means to incorporate prayer and meditation and look to God's will and not my own. And then finally, I'm struck that you both have pointed out that conflict is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to witness to our mission. Surely sometimes things are too raw to dialogue, and we have to be respectful of that. But at the same time, it's a way to refine ideas and get to a deeper level. So the process, the importance of Ignatian principles, the opportunity that conflict provides. I'm wondering, after everything we've talked about, that's what I bring forward. I wonder, Julie, maybe start with you. What do you see as kind of the one takeaway you would offer to listeners today, one disposition that campus leaders might embrace this year?
I think, in the trainings that we've done with faculty and administrators and staff, that the practice when people have to do the listening themselves, that's always a learning process, because especially for people who are used to being in front of in the sort of the front of the room, we can sometimes be called the sage on the stage, or, who are the experts, for themselves to step back and have that moment of really deep listening and empathetic listening. It's not easy. And I think it's a good practice for any leader to do, and then to be able to sit them with discomfort that you hear, and not kind of immediately even try to fix it, certainly not ignore it or silence it, but just sit in that discomfort. So I think those two things, the listening, the practicing of that, making sure that you're being intentional about it, and then sitting with whatever it is that arises out of it.
Wonderful. So helpful. David, how about you? What do you see as one disposition that campus leaders might embrace this year? One thing they might take from our conversation?
Actually, I want to connect with what Julie just shared about those skills of listening with intention. And I'd say, to back up, and what is the spirit with which we do that listening. And so I would say that the stance of a kind of humble curiosity, and what Julie shared, that those things go hand in hand. That if I have a humble curiosity, that no matter what, when someone has a totally diverse perspective, they might be on the other side of an ideological polarity. The sense that they, in their own mind, have a rationale, a story, a kind of commitment to the good, and I want to understand what that is all about, because at first glance I may have no clue. So do I have that humble curiosity, that spirit of inquiry?
Wonderful. Humble curiosity and a listening approach. I love this. And I love this conversation. Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you so much, David. It's been so nice to be in conversation with you. Jim, thank you so much for having us here. And I look forward to continuing this conversation going forward. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening today. For further coverage and reflection on these issues, and on a wide variety of other topics relevant to higher education and Jesuit mission, please visit conversationsmagazine.org.